The fluorescent lights above the pharmacy counter flickered like dying fireflies as I counted the crumpled bills and loose change for the third time, my fingers trembling so badly the coins kept slipping between them and clattering onto the counter with sounds that might as well have been gunshots in the silence that had fallen behind me. $12 short. I was $12 short for Grandma's heart medication, and the line behind me had grown to at least 8 people, all of them shifting their weight and sighing with the particular kind of impatience that comes from watching someone else's poverty play out in real time at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. The pharmacist, a middle-aged woman with glasses hanging from a chain around her neck and exhaustion written into every line of her face, drummed her fingers on the counter and glanced at the growing line with the kind of look that said she'd seen this scene play out too many times before and had exactly zero sympathy left to give. Rain hammered against the windows of the dingy downtown pharmacy, the sound mixing with the buzz of the dying lights and the mechanical hum of the refrigeration units, where they kept the expensive medications that people like me could barely afford, even with insurance that covered almost nothing. I picked up the 2 prescription bottles, the blood pressure medication in my left hand and the pain pills in my right, and felt the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on my chest like a physical thing. My grandmother needed both, had needed both for the past 3 months since her last heart episode, but I could only afford one, and the rent was due in 3 days, and I'd already skipped 2 meals this week to make sure she ate properly. "I'll just take the blood pressure medication," I heard myself say, my voice coming out smaller than I intended, barely more than a whisper that I had to repeat louder when the pharmacist asked me to speak up. "The pain pills can wait." The pharmacist's expression shifted slightly, not quite softening but losing some of its hardness as she glanced at the prescription information on her computer screen and then back at my face. "Ma'am, your grandmother needs both prescriptions," she said, her tone professional, but with an edge of something that might have been concern or might have been frustration that she had to be the bearer of bad news to desperate people all night long. "The heart condition requires pain management to prevent stress on the cardiac system." "I know," I whispered, feeling heat crawl up my neck as someone behind me in line made an audible sound of frustration. "I know she needs both, but I can only afford one right now, and I'll come back for the other one as soon as I can." Behind me, I could feel the judgment radiating off the other customers like heat, their irritation at being delayed mixing with that particular kind of discomfort people feel when confronted with someone else's financial struggle, and I wanted nothing more than to disappear through the floor or run out into the rain and never come back. I pushed through the pharmacy door with the single prescription bottle clutched in my fist, like it was something precious, instead of a reminder of everything I couldn't afford, and the rain hit me immediately, cold and relentless, soaking through my thin jacket within seconds, as I stood under the flickering neon sign that cast everything in sickly green light. The sidewalk was slick and reflective, puddles forming in every crack and depression, and steam rose from the subway grate across the street in ghostly white plumes that twisted and disappeared into the darkness above. And that's when I saw him. The familiar hunched shape of Danny curled against the brick wall of the pharmacy, shaking so violently I could see it from 10 feet away. Danny was a fixture in this neighborhood, a veteran who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan and come home to find his wife had left, and his job had been filled, and his apartment had been rented to someone else, and he'd been on the streets for 3 years now, always polite, always grateful for any small kindness, and I'd given him a few dollars here and there when I could spare it, which wasn't often. But tonight, something was different. Something was wrong in the way he was curled in on himself, his body racked with tremors that had nothing to do with just being cold. And when I knelt beside him on the wet pavement, not caring that the water soaked through my jeans immediately, I could see his lips were blue, actually blue, the color of hypothermia and death creeping in. "Danny," I said, touching his shoulder gently, trying not to startle him, but needing to get his attention, needing to see his eyes and know if he was still really there behind them. "Danny, When's the last time you ate? His eyes opened slowly, taking too long to focus on my face, and when he finally recognized me, his attempt at a smile was heartbreaking in its weakness. 2 days, he mumbled, his words slurring together. Maybe 3. His whole body was shaking and I could smell the sickness on him, that particular smell of a body shutting down from exposure and hunger, and the accumulated damage of living on concrete and breathing exhaust fumes and never being warm or dry or safe. My grandfather had been a veteran too, had served in Vietnam, and come home with demons he never talked about, but that I could see in his eyes sometimes when I was little, before the cancer took him when I was 12. And looking at Danny now, I saw my grandfather's face, saw all the men and women who'd served and been forgotten by the country they'd protected. Distant sirens wailed somewhere in the city, that constant urban soundtrack of emergency and crisis, and the rain kept falling and Danny kept shaking, and I made a decision that I knew was stupid, knew was irresponsible, knew would make my own situation even more desperate than it already was. I reached into my jacket pocket, where I'd tucked the last $20 bill I had in the world, the money that was supposed to buy me food for the rest of the week, the money that was supposed to help me figure out how to make rent, and I pulled it out and pressed it into Danny's cold hand. "Danny, take this," I said, my own hands shaking almost as badly as his, as I pressed the $20 bill into his palm and closed his fingers around it, feeling the coldness of his skin and the way his whole hand trembled. "Please, get something hot to eat. The pharmacy has a little cafe section in the back, and they're open all night, and you can get soup and coffee and just sit somewhere warm for a while." "Miss Maya," Danny started, and I could see tears forming in his eyes, actual tears mixing with the rain on his face. "This is too much. I can't take your—" "Just take it," I interrupted, not wanting to hear his protest, not wanting to think too hard about what I was doing, or I might change my mind and take it back and hate myself forever for it. "You served our country, Danny. Someone should take care of you." The words came out fierce, almost angry, because I was angry, angry at a system that let veterans sleep on streets, angry at a world where I had to choose between my grandmother's pain medication and keeping myself fed, angry at everything and nothing all at once. Danny's face crumpled and he started crying in earnest. Not the quiet, dignified tears of someone trying to maintain pride, but the broken sobs of someone who'd forgotten what kindness felt like. And I couldn't watch it because if I watched, I would start crying too, and I was barely holding myself together as it was. "Go inside," I told him, standing up quickly, my knees protesting from kneeling on the wet concrete. "Get warm, get food. And Danny, stay inside as long as they'll let you, okay?" Across the street, a black Escalade sat with its engine running, exhaust mixing with the steam from the subway grate. Its windows tinted so dark, they looked like pools of oil reflecting the streetlights. But I didn't notice it, didn't register anything except the need to get away from Danny before I changed my mind and asked for the money back, before the reality of what I'd just done crashed down on me completely. I turned and started walking fast, my wet sneakers squelching with each step, my jacket soaked through, the prescription bottle still clutched in one hand, while the other hand felt empty and light without the weight of that last $20 bill. Behind me I could hear Danny calling out "thank you" and "God bless you" and other things I couldn't make out through the rain and the distance I was putting between us, and I didn't look back, couldn't look back. The Escalade's engine continued its low purr as I walked past it without seeing it, without knowing that inside a strikingly handsome man in his late 20s with dark eyes and darker purposes had watched the entire exchange, had seen me give away what his trained observation told him was likely my last money, had witnessed something that would change both our lives in ways I couldn't begin to imagine. 8 blocks stretched ahead of me like 8 miles as I started the walk home, too broke to afford even the $2 subway fare that would have gotten me there in 10 minutes instead of the 30 it would take on foot through rain that showed no signs of stopping. My sneakers were completely soaked now, water squelching between my toes with every step, and the thin jacket I wore did absolutely nothing against the cold that seeped into my bones and settled there like it planned to stay forever. the prescription bottle pressed into my palm where I gripped it too tightly. A small, hard reminder of the choice I'd made, of the pills Grandma would get, and the ones she wouldn't, of the $20 I'd given away that I desperately needed. Tears started sliding down my face, somewhere around block 3, mixing with the rain so at least no one could tell I was crying. Not that anyone was out in this weather anyway, just me and the occasional taxi splashing through puddles and sending up waves of dirty water. Grandma needs the medicine more than I need food this week, I told myself, trying to make the math work in my head the way I'd been making impossible math work for the past 3 years since I'd dropped out of nursing school to take care of her full time. We'll figure it out, we always do, but the words felt hollow even in my own mind because I was running out of ways to figure it out, running out of things to cut from a budget that was already cut to the bone. The neighborhood changed as I walked, the commercial district with its chain stores and bright lights giving way to the run-down residential area where rent was cheap because everything else was broken. Streetlights that hadn't worked in months, leaving whole blocks in darkness. Graffiti covering every available surface. Chain-link fences around empty lots full of weeds and trash. My apartment building came into view finally, a 5-story walk-up with crumbling brick and a front door that hadn't locked properly in over a year. The super saying he'd fix it every time I mentioned it, and then never actually fixing anything. I trudged up to the entrance, so exhausted I could barely lift my feet, my body aching from the double shift I'd worked at the diner yesterday and the shift I had tomorrow, and the constant grinding stress of never having enough, never being enough, never catching a break. Behind me, a block back and staying carefully in the shadows, the black Escalade rolled slowly through the streets, its expensive engine barely audible, its driver and passenger watching my entire journey, witnessing my struggle in a way that made it real and documentable and impossible to dismiss as exaggeration. But I didn't see it, didn't know I was being followed, didn't realize that a strikingly handsome man in his late 20s was cataloging every detail of my life and making decisions that would change everything. The pounding on the door jolted me awake from a fitful sleep full of dreams about drowning in bills and prescriptions I couldn't afford, and for a confused moment I thought maybe I'd imagined it, but then it came again, loud and insistent, the kind of knocking that said someone wasn't going away until I answered. I stumbled out of the secondhand futon that served as my bed in our cramped studio apartment, checking on Grandma through the curtain we'd hung to give her bedroom some privacy, and seeing she was still asleep. Thank God, because she needed rest more than she needed to be woken by whatever crisis was happening now. Morning light filtered through the one window we had, illuminating the peeling paint on the walls, the water stain on the ceiling that had been there when we moved in 2 years ago. The photos on the wall of happier times when my parents were alive, and money wasn't something we had to think about every single second of every single day. I shuffled to the door in my oversized sleep shirt and bare feet, calling out, "Who is it?" and hearing Mr. Kowalski, the super's gravelly voice, saying he had a delivery for me. I opened the door to find him holding an enormous box, the kind of packaging that looked expensive just by existing, thick cardboard and professional shipping labels, and my name printed in neat letters across the top. Confusion washed over me as I took the box from him, nearly dropping it because it was heavier than I expected. "Who delivered this?" I asked, my voice still rough with sleep and suspicion already creeping up my spine, because I hadn't ordered anything, couldn't afford to order anything. "Some guy in a suit," Mr. Kowalski said, scratching his gray stubble and looking at me with curious eyes. "Real fancy type, didn't leave a name, just said to make sure you got it personally, made me promise I'd put it right in your hands and nobody else's." I thanked him and closed the door, setting the box on our tiny kitchen table and staring at it like it might explode. My hands shook as I found scissors and cut through the packing tape, pulling back the flaps to reveal tissue paper, and beneath that, contents that made my heart stop. Both prescriptions, the blood pressure medication I'd purchased, and the pain pills I'd had to leave behind. Both bottles full, and labeled with Grandma's name. An envelope, thick and heavy, that I opened with trembling fingers to find $50 bills, $5,000 in cash, more money than I'd seen in one place in my entire life. And a small card, plain white with a single line printed in elegant script that made chills run down my spine. For someone who gives when they have nothing. Panic set in the moment I fully processed what I was holding. $5,000 in medications that someone had somehow obtained and delivered to my door, and my first instinct was that this had to be a mistake, had to be meant for someone else because things like this didn't happen to people like me. I turned the box inside out, looking for a return address or any information about who had sent it, but found nothing except that single card with its cryptic message. And when Grandma woke up an hour later, and I showed her what had arrived, she went pale and immediately said we had to return it. "We don't take charity from strangers, Maya," she said in that firm voice that reminded me she'd raised 3 children on a waitress salary and had never taken a handout in her life. "This feels wrong." "But Grandma, this is exactly enough for your medications for 6 months," I heard myself argue, even as my own instincts screamed that she was right. That accepting mysterious packages full of cash was how people ended up in terrible situations. I grabbed my jacket and headed to the nearest police station, the package tucked under my arm, certain they would know what to do, or at least take a report or something. The desk sergeant, a tired-looking man with coffee stains on his uniform, barely looked up as I tried to explain the situation, and when I finally got his attention, his response was to ask if I was really complaining about someone giving me money. "Ma'am, we have actual crimes to deal with," he said, already looking past me to the next person in line. "If you don't want the money, donate it to charity, but don't waste our time with this." I left the station feeling more afraid than when I'd entered, because his dismissiveness made me realize that whatever this was, I was on my own with it. Back at the apartment, I spent 3 hours on my laptop researching mysterious benefactors and anonymous gifts, and every search led me down darker and darker rabbit holes. Stories about money laundering and mafia connections, and people who accepted gifts and then found themselves owing debts they could never repay. My hands shook as I read article after article about organized crime and how they operated, how they drew normal people into their world through seeming acts of kindness that turned into chains, how once you were in their debt, you belonged to them. The card sat on the table mocking me with its elegant script, for someone who gives when they have nothing, and I realized with growing horror that someone had been watching me last night, had seen me give Danny that $20, had followed me home and investigated me enough to know about Grandma's prescriptions and our financial situation. I looked at the $5,000 spread across our kitchen table and then at Grandma's worried face and felt trapped between desperate need and bone-deep fear that accepting this gift would cost me something far more valuable than money. That evening, just as the sun was setting and turning the sky the color of a bruise, I looked out the window and felt my blood turn to ice because the black Escalade was back, parked directly in front of my building with its engine running and its dark windows reflecting the streetlights like mirrors. I watched as the driver's door opened and a man emerged, tall and imposing in an expensive suit that looked completely out of place in this neighborhood, his movements controlled and purposeful as he scanned the building, before his eyes settled on my window, and I jerked back, even though I knew he couldn't possibly see me from that distance. My phone was in my hand, and I was ready to call the police when he disappeared into the building, and moments later I heard footsteps in the hallway, measured and unhurried, stopping right outside my door, followed by a polite knock that somehow felt more threatening than pounding would have been. I looked through the peephole and saw the man from the street standing there, his face calm and patient, and when he spoke, his voice was clear enough to hear through the cheap door. "Miss Chen, my name is Marco. I work for Mr. Caruso, who would very much like to speak with you." Terror flooded through me, and I backed away from the door, calling out that I didn't know any Mr. Caruso and that I was calling the police right now. "Mr. Caruso simply wishes to speak with you," Marco replied, his tone remaining polite and measured in a way that was somehow worse than aggression. "You're not in danger, he just wants to explain about the package you received." "I don't want to talk to anyone," I said, my voice shaking, pressing myself against the wall where Grandma sat in her chair watching me with worried eyes. "I'm calling the police right now. The police won't help you understand why you received that package," Marco said, and I could hear something like amusement in his voice. "He will. Mr. Caruso can explain everything, and you can return the money if you choose. You have that option." I moved to the window and saw that neighbors were starting to appear in their windows. Mrs. Rodriguez across the way and the college kids on the second floor. Everyone watching this expensive car and this man in a suit who clearly didn't belong here. "Mr. Caruso appreciates your kindness to veterans," Marco continued. And those words froze me in place, because they revealed what I'd suspected and feared. That someone had been watching me last night, had seen me with Danny, knew things about me that strangers shouldn't know. "He particularly wants to discuss that with you, and I promise you're in no danger. He simply wants to meet the woman who gave away her last dollar to help someone in need." Something about the specific mention of it being my last dollar, something about the way he said it with what sounded like genuine respect, made me pause, made me consider that maybe the only way to understand what was happening was to face it directly. The ride in the Escalade felt like being transported to another world. The leather seats softer than anything I'd ever sat on. The interior smelling of expensive cologne and new car. Marco driving in silence while I sat in the back, clutching my phone and trying not to think about all the true crime podcasts I'd listened to, where women got into cars with strange men and were never seen again. We drove for 20 minutes through parts of the city I'd only seen from bus windows, the buildings getting nicer and the streets getting cleaner, until we pulled up in front of an Italian restaurant with a name I couldn't pronounce and a facade that screamed old money and exclusivity. The restaurant was dark, closed despite it being dinner time, and Marco led me through the front door that was unlocked just for us, into a space that took my breath away with its old-world elegance, dark wood and white tablecloths and paintings on the walls that looked like they belonged in museums. He guided me through the main dining room to a private room in the back, opening the door to reveal a single table set for two, candles providing the only light. And sitting at the table was the most strikingly handsome man in his late 20s I'd ever seen. Dark hair perfectly styled, sharp cheekbones, and a jaw that could have been carved from marble, wearing a suit that probably cost more than 6 months of my rent. He stood as I entered, his movements fluid and controlled, and his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made me feel like he was cataloging every detail of my appearance, taking in my worn jeans and clearance rack sweater and secondhand jacket, seeing through to something deeper. "Please sit," he said, his voice low and cultured with an accent I couldn't quite place. "You haven't eaten today." The statement, rather than question format, sent alarm bells ringing in my head, and I stayed standing near the door, one hand on the frame like it was an anchor to reality. "How do you know that?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt, trying to mask the fear with defiance because I'd learned early that showing weakness invited predators. "The same way I know you gave your last $20 to a homeless veteran instead of feeding yourself," he replied, gesturing to the chair across from him. "The same way I know your grandmother's medications cost more than you can afford and that you work double shifts at a diner but still can't make rent most months." His knowledge of my life should have terrified me, and it did. But it also made me angry. Angry that this stranger had invaded my privacy, angry that he'd been watching me, angry that he sat there in his expensive suit in his private dining room, acting like he had any right to know these things about me. I finally moved to the chair and sat down stiffly, my back straight and my hands in my lap, meeting his eyes with as much courage as I could gather while everything in me screamed to run. "So you stalked me," I said, letting the accusation hang in the air between us. "Had me investigated like I'm some kind of criminal." He leaned back in his chair with an expression I couldn't read, something between amusement and genuine interest, his dark eyes never leaving my face. "I wanted to understand who gives away their last dollar," he said simply, as If that explained everything, as if that made surveillance and investigation somehow acceptable. I was outside the pharmacy last night waiting for someone, and I saw you with that veteran, saw you give him money that you clearly needed yourself, and I needed to know why. Someone who remembers what it's like to have nothing, I replied, the words coming out sharper than I intended, defensive and raw. Someone who knows that being hungry and cold and desperate isn't a moral failing, it's just bad luck and a system that doesn't care if you live or die. Something shifted in his expression then, a crack in the controlled facade, and for just a moment I saw something that looked almost like pain flicker across his face before it was gone. As if on cue, a door opened and waiters entered carrying plates of food that smelled so incredible, my stomach growled audibly, despite my best efforts to remain aloof and in control of this situation. I tried to refuse, tried to say I wasn't hungry, but my body betrayed me as the scent of real Italian food, not the reheated pasta I served at the diner, but actual handmade food prepared by someone who knew what they were doing, filled the small room. He noticed my hesitation, and something in his eyes softened almost imperceptibly. "Please eat," he said, and this time it wasn't a command, but something closer to a request. "I'm not going to hurt you, Maya. I just want to talk, and talking is easier over food." The use of my first name should have felt invasive, but instead, it felt strangely intimate, like we knew each other even though we'd just met. And I found myself picking up the fork and taking a bite of risotto that was so perfectly cooked, I almost cried. We ate in silence for a few minutes while I tried to organize my thoughts, tried to understand what this man wanted from me, and why my act of kindness had mattered enough to prompt all of this. "My father was a veteran," he said suddenly, breaking the silence, his voice lower now, more personal. "He came home from war and found he had nothing, no job, no home, no one who cared if he lived or died, and he died alone on a street corner when I was 12 years old." I looked up from my plate and saw genuine emotion in his eyes, saw past the expensive suit and the power and the control to something human and wounded underneath. I set down my fork with more force than necessary, the clatter of silverware against china breaking the moment of shared vulnerability, and looked directly into his dark eyes with a determination born of fear and anger mixing together in my chest. "Who are you really?" I demanded, my voice steadier than I felt. "Not just your name, but who you actually are, and what you want from me, and why you're telling me about your father, like we're friends when we both know I'm here because your people forced me to come." He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers wrapped around a glass of red wine that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and when he spoke, his voice was calm and matter-of-fact, in a way that made the words even more terrifying. "I run the city's port operations among other enterprises," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "I'm what people call a crime boss, and before you ask, yes, I'm involved in activities that exist outside the law, and yes, I have blood on my hands that will never wash clean." The room seemed to tilt around me as his words sank in, as the reality of who I was sitting across from became undeniable. "You're telling me you're in the Mafia," I whispered, my throat suddenly dry despite the water glass in front of me. "I'm telling you, I'm a businessman who operates in gray areas," he replied, leaning forward slightly. "But I have a code, Maya. I protect what's mine. I don't hurt innocents, and I sure as hell don't let good people suffer when I have the resources to help them." I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the floor, my heart pounding in my chest like it was trying to escape my rib cage. "I need to leave," I said, backing toward the door. "This was a mistake. I shouldn't have come here. Just forget you ever saw me and I'll return your money, and we can both pretend this never happened." He remained seated, his posture relaxed and non-threatening, but something in his eyes was intense and focused in a way that made me freeze with my hand on the doorknob. "You can leave," he said quietly. "I'm not going to stop you, But you need to understand that you've already been seen with me. My enemies already know that I brought you here. And in my world, that makes you a person of interest, whether you want to be or not." Through the window behind him, I could see the city lights spreading out like a glittering carpet, and I realized with sinking certainty that somewhere in all those lights were people who now considered me connected to Dante Caruso, who might see me as leverage or threat or opportunity. And walking out that door wouldn't make me safe, it would just make me alone. My hand was on the door handle when his voice cut through the room like a blade, calm and measured, and somehow more frightening because of how controlled it was. "You can walk away," he said, still seated at the table with that infuriating composure. "But understand that my enemies will assume you mean something to me, and they'll act on that assumption regardless of the truth." I turned to face him, anger finally overtaking fear because this whole situation was insane and I'd done nothing wrong except try to help someone in need. "I'm nobody," I said, my voice rising. "They'll lose interest once they realize I'm just some broke waitress with a sick grandmother who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." "You gave away your last dollar to a stranger," Dante replied, and now he did stand, moving around the table with a grace that seemed at odds with his size. "That makes you rare, Maya, valuable in a world where most people wouldn't spit on a dying man if it cost them a penny, and that makes you a perfect target for someone who wants to hurt me." I grabbed the door handle and pulled, but the door didn't budge, and through the small window in the door, I could see Marco standing on the other side, his broad shoulders blocking any possible exit. Panic flared hot in my chest as I realized I was truly trapped, that this wasn't just a conversation I could walk away from, that somehow in the space of 24 hours, my life had spiraled into something I couldn't control. "Let me out," I demanded, turning back to face Dante, who had moved closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and masculine that made my head spin. "You can't keep me here. This is kidnapping." "I'm not keeping you here," he said. "But his rival Viktor Volkov has people who saw you arrive, who watched you walk into my restaurant, who are right now making assumptions about who you are and what you mean to me, and those assumptions will put you in danger the moment you step outside without my protection." His eyes were dark and intense as he looked down at me, and I hated that even terrified and angry, I noticed how strikingly handsome he was, how his late-20s face held both youth and a hardness that spoke of experiences I couldn't imagine. "Victor is not like me," Dante continued, his voice dropping lower. "He has no code, no lines he won't cross. And if he thinks hurting you will give him leverage over me or my operations, he won't hesitate. He'll take you and your grandmother and use you until you're no longer useful and then dispose of you like garbage." The casual way he described such horror made my knees weak, and I pressed my back against the door for support. "I won't be owned by a criminal," I said, lifting my chin and meeting his eyes even though everything in me wanted to look away from that intense gaze. "I'm not asking to own you," Dante replied, and he took another step closer, close enough now that I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact, close enough that the heat from his body seemed to radiate across the small space between us. "I'm asking to protect you from the consequences of my interest in you. Consequences you didn't ask for and don't deserve." "And if I refuse?" I asked, my voice coming out breathier than I intended, hating that my body was responding to his proximity in ways that had nothing to do with fear. "Then I'll have men watching you anyway," he said, his eyes dropping briefly to my lips before returning to meet my gaze. "But it would be easier if you cooperated, easier for you to live your life without constantly looking over your shoulder, easier for your grandmother to get the care she needs without worrying about who might be following you home from the pharmacy." The mention of Grandma hit me like a physical blow because I'd been so focused on my own fear and anger that I hadn't fully considered what this meant for her, how my connection to this man had put her in danger too. He saw the shift in my expression, and something like sympathy crossed his face, softening the hard edges just slightly. I can move you both to a secure location, he continued, his voice gentler now. Somewhere comfortable with medical care for your grandmother, and protection for you both, until I resolve the situation with Victor. The word resolve hung heavy in the air between us, and I wondered what exactly that meant, what he would have to do to make us safe again, and I realized I didn't want to know the details. How long? I whispered, my resistance crumbling under the weight of reality. How long would we have to stay in this secure location? As long as it takes, he replied honestly. Could be a week, could be a month. I won't lie to you, Maya. Victor is powerful and deeply entrenched in this city. But I'm more powerful, and I will handle this. The certainty in his voice should have been arrogant, but instead, it was just factual, a statement of truth from someone who knew exactly what he was capable of. I felt tears burning behind my eyes and blinked them back furiously because I would not cry in front of this man, would not show him just how completely my life had been upended. He reached out slowly, giving me time to pull away, and when I didn't, his hand cupped my cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped despite my best efforts. I'll keep you safe, he said softly. And beneath the promise, I heard something else, something that sounded almost like tenderness. Both of you, I give you my word. I stepped back from his touch and straightened my spine, wiping at my eyes quickly before looking him directly in the face with a determination that surprised even me. If I'm accepting your help, I said, my voice stronger now, then you help people who actually need it. Not just me, but Danny and others like him, veterans who served this country and got left behind. His eyebrows rose, and something like surprise flickered across his face, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. You're negotiating with me, he said, and it wasn't quite a question, but more like he was testing the reality of the situation. Yes, I'm negotiating, I replied, crossing my arms over my chest. You said I'm rare, that I'm valuable, then treat me like I have value beyond being a pawn in your game with Victor. Treat me like someone whose conditions actually matter. For a long moment, he just stared at me, and I could see him reassessing, recalculating, seeing me differently than he had before. And then he did something completely unexpected. He laughed. A genuine sound of amusement that transformed his entire face and made him look younger and less dangerous. Marco must have heard it through the door because I heard a surprised sound from the other side, as if Dante laughing was a rare enough occurrence to shock his bodyguard. What do you want? Dante asked, moving back to the table and gesturing for me to sit again. And this time, when I took the chair, it felt different. Less like a prisoner, and more like a participant in whatever was happening between us. He reached for a bottle of wine and poured a glass, offering it to me with a questioning look, and I shook my head because I needed to stay clear-headed for this conversation, needed all my wits about me. He nodded and set the glass aside without argument, respecting my choice, and poured water instead, which he slid across the table to me. I want housing for homeless veterans, I said, the words coming faster now as the idea took shape. Real housing, not just a shelter bed for the night, but actual apartments where they can live with dignity, and medical care and job training and whatever else they need to get back on their feet. His expression was unreadable as he listened, his fingers steepled under his chin. And in return, you'll accept my protection without fighting me every step of the way, he asked. I'll cooperate, I agreed, but I won't be a prisoner. I'll need to check on Danny and make sure he's okay, and I'll need to see that you actually follow through on what you're promising. Deal, Dante said immediately, extending his hand across the table. I'll have my people start on the housing project tomorrow. We'll call it the Second Chances Program or something similar, and you'll have full access to oversee it once the immediate danger has passed. I hesitated only a moment before taking his hand, feeling the warmth and strength of his grip, the calluses that spoke of a life more complicated than just sitting behind desks. And in that handshake something shifted between us, a recognition that we were no longer captor and captive, but something else entirely. Within 3 hours of shaking hands with Dante, I found myself standing in a penthouse apartment that occupied the entire top floor of a building in a neighborhood I'd only ever seen in movies about rich people. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering city below, furniture that looked like it belonged in design magazines, and a kitchen so modern and well-equipped I wasn't even sure what half the appliances did. Marco and two other men had collected me and Grandma from our apartment with an efficiency that was almost frightening, packing our meager belongings in less than 20 minutes and installing us in this place that felt more like a luxury hotel than somewhere people actually lived. Grandma had been silent during the car ride, her hand gripping mine tightly, and now as she sat on the enormous leather sofa in the living room, she looked so small and out of place that guilt crashed over me in waves. "This man is dangerous, Maya," she said quietly once we were alone, the security detail having retreated to positions outside the door and in the building lobby. "I know, Grandma," I replied, sitting beside her and taking her frail hand in mine, hating myself for dragging her into this situation. "But he looks at you like you're the only person in the room," she continued, and there was something in her voice that made me turn to face her fully. "You saw him for 2 minutes, I protested, feeling heat rise in my cheeks at the implication. "That's all it takes to see when someone's falling," she said, with the kind of certainty that came from 70 years of watching people and understanding human nature better than most. Before I could respond, one of Dante's people knocked and entered with several large bags, setting them down and explaining that they contained 3 months' worth of Grandma's medications, fresh clothes in both our sizes, and whatever toiletries we might need. After he left, I explored the space more fully, finding 2 bedrooms each with its own bathroom, the smaller one already set up for Grandma with a medical alert system and easy access to everything she might need. I stood in the larger bedroom that was apparently mine and stared at the king-sized bed with its expensive linens and the walk-in closet that held more clothes than I'd owned in my entire life, all in my exact size, which meant Dante had been thorough in his investigation of me. The bathroom was marble and chrome with a shower that had more jets and settings than seemed necessary. And when I finally stripped off my worn clothes and stood under water that was actually hot, and stayed hot without running out after 5 minutes, I felt tears mixing with the water because it had been so long since I'd felt anything approaching comfort or safety. But standing there in luxury I hadn't earned while Grandma sat worried in the other room, and somewhere in the city, a strikingly handsome man in his late 20s who'd turned my life upside down made plans to handle the danger he'd brought to my door. I couldn't tell if I was being protected or imprisoned. Couldn't tell if the strange pull I felt toward Dante Caruso was gratitude, or something far more dangerous. Sleep was impossible despite the comfortable bed and the quiet hum of expensive air conditioning, and around midnight I gave up trying and wrapped myself in the oversized robe I'd found hanging in the bathroom before slipping out onto the balcony that extended from the living room. The city spread out below me in a carpet of lights, millions of people living their lives while I stood trapped in luxury 20 floors above them. And I'd never felt more like a bird in a gilded cage, surrounded by beauty I couldn't enjoy because the door was locked from the outside. I was so lost in thought, I didn't hear the penthouse door open or footsteps crossing the living room. Didn't realize I wasn't alone until a voice behind me said my name quietly enough not to startle me, but clearly enough that I whirled around to find Dante standing in the doorway to the balcony. He'd changed from his suit into dark jeans and a black sweater that somehow made him look both more casual and more dangerous. His hair slightly mussed, like he'd been running his hands through it, and there were shadows under his eyes that suggested he couldn't sleep either. "I wanted to make sure you were settled," he said, moving on to the balcony, but keeping distance between us, his hands in his pockets. "Are you comfortable? Does your grandmother need anything?" "We're fine," I replied automatically, then reconsidered, because we weren't fine. None of this was fine. "Why did you really do this?" I asked, turning back to face the city. "The money, the protection, all of it. Why?" "Because when I saw you give away your last dollar, I saw something I haven't seen in 20 years in my business," he said, coming to stand beside me at the railing, both of us looking out at the lights, rather than at each other. Genuine goodness, the kind that exists without calculation or expectation of reward, the kind that acts simply because it's right. And that's rare in your world, I asked, though I already knew the answer. It's extinct, he replied, his voice carrying a weariness that made him sound older than his late 20s. Everyone wants something, everyone has an angle, everyone is playing a game, but you gave away money you desperately needed to someone you barely knew and got nothing in return except the knowledge that you'd helped another human being. We stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of traffic floating up from far below, the stars barely visible through the light pollution, but present if you knew where to look. I'm not good, I said quietly. I'm just someone who got lucky enough to remember what it feels like to need help. Maybe that's the same thing, Dante replied, and when I glanced at him, I found him already looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. The air between us felt charged suddenly, heavy with something unspoken, and I was acutely aware of how close he was standing, how easy it would be to close the distance between us, how much I wanted to, despite knowing it was a terrible idea. I woke the morning after that charged moment on the balcony to the sound of raised voices coming from somewhere else in the penthouse. And when I emerged from my bedroom, still in the oversized robe, I found Marco standing outside a door I hadn't noticed before, looking grim and tense in a way that made my stomach drop. "Something's happened," he said before I could ask, "and Mr. Caruso is handling it, but you should probably wait until he's finished with his call." That's when I heard Dante's voice through the door, speaking rapid Italian in a tone that was cold and deadly, and nothing like the almost gentle voice he'd used with me last night, and fear spiked through me as I pushed past Marco and opened the door without knocking. Dante was behind a desk in what was clearly his home office, phone pressed to his ear, and three other men in suits stood around the room, all of them turning to look at me with expressions ranging from surprise to disapproval, but I only had eyes for Dante, whose face went from furious to carefully controlled the moment he saw me. He said something sharp in Italian and ended the call, setting the phone down slowly. "Maya, you shouldn't be in here," he said, but I was. Already moving toward the desk because I'd seen what was displayed on his computer screen, a photo of Danny in a hospital bed, his face swollen and bruised beyond recognition. "What happened to him?" I demanded, my voice coming out as a near shout. "Tell me what happened to Danny." "Victor had him beaten and left in an alley with a message," Dante said, standing and moving around the desk. "Maya, I need you to calm down." "This is my fault," I said, feeling tears burning behind my eyes as I stared at Danny's battered face on the screen. "He got hurt because I helped him, because I gave him that money and you saw it, and now Victor is using him to get to me. He got hurt because Victor is a monster who uses kindness as a weapon," Dante corrected, his voice hard. "This is what he does, Maya. He finds the soft spots and he presses until something breaks." "Then let me see him," I said, meeting Dante's eyes with all the determination I could muster. "Let me go to the hospital and make sure he's okay. That's exactly what Victor wants," Dante replied, and I could see his jaw tightening with frustration. "He's baiting you, using Danny to draw you out into the open where you're vulnerable." "I don't care," I shot back, my voice rising. "Danny is in that hospital bed because of me, and I won't hide in this luxury prison while he suffers alone." Dante's men exchanged glances, and I saw something pass between them, some silent communication about their boss and the woman who was yelling at him in his own office. And when Dante's expression softened just slightly, one of them actually looked surprised. 2 hours later, I was in the back of the Escalade, with Dante beside me and Marco driving while two other vehicles full of his men formed a convoy around us, heading toward the hospital where Danny was recovering in what Dante had described as a private, secure wing. The drive felt endless, even though it was only 20 minutes, my hands twisted together in my lap, while Dante sat calm and controlled beside me, occasionally speaking into his phone in Italian, but mostly just watching me with an expression I couldn't read. When we finally arrived, we were escorted through a private entrance and up a back elevator to a floor that looked more like a luxury hotel than a hospital, and Danny's room at the end of the hall was guarded by two of Dante's men who nodded respectfully as we passed. Inside, Danny was propped up in bed, looking small and broken, his face swollen with bruises that were turning purple and yellow, his left arm in a cast, and when he saw me, his eyes filled with tears. "Miss Maya," he said, his voice rough and painful sounding. "I'm so sorry. They kept asking about you." I rushed to his bedside and took his good hand in mine, tears streaming down my face as I looked at what Victor had done to this gentle man who'd never hurt anyone. "Danny, it's okay," I said, squeezing his hand gently. "It's not your fault. None of this is your fault." "Miss Maya, these men," he continued, glancing nervously at Dante, who stood near the door watching us with that same softness I'd glimpsed last night on the balcony. "They wanted to know about you and that guy, the one who gave you the package." "You'll be safe now," Dante said, moving closer to the bed, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "I give you my word, Danny. No one will hurt you again." Danny looked confused, looking between me and Dante like he was trying to understand what was happening, and I realized he probably thought Dante was the one who'd ordered the beating. "Dante's setting up housing for veterans," I explained, still holding Danny's hand. "Real housing, Danny. Apartments where you can live with dignity, and medical care and job training, everything you need, and you'll never sleep on the street again." "Why would you do that?" Danny asked, his eyes fixed on Dante with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Because someone I respect asked me to," Dante replied simply, "and because you served this country and deserve better than what you've received." I watched Dante as he spoke and saw something in his face that I hadn't seen before, a genuine compassion that existed beneath all the control and danger, and I realized that when he gave his word, he meant it. On the drive back to the penthouse, rain started falling against the windows in steady sheets that turned the city outside into a blur of lights and shadows, and the enclosed space of the car felt suddenly intimate in a way that made my heart beat faster as I sat beside Dante in the back seat. "Why did you really help Danny?" I asked quietly, watching his profile as he stared out at the rain. "Because I saw your face when you talked to him, and it was more than just keeping a promise to me." He was silent for so long, I thought he might not answer, his jaw tight and his hands resting on his thighs, with a tension that suggested whatever he was about to say cost him something to reveal. "My father came home from Vietnam with nothing," he finally said, his voice low and rough with emotion he was fighting to control. "The family business had been taken while he served, stolen by rivals who saw his absence as opportunity, and when he came back, broken and traumatized, there was no place for him, no job, no home, nothing but the streets and the bottle, and the slow death that comes from being forgotten." "I'm so sorry," I whispered, reaching out without thinking to touch his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles beneath the expensive fabric of his sweater. "Don't be," Dante replied, finally turning to look at me with eyes that held old pain and older rage. "It taught me everything I needed to know about this world. That power protects and weakness kills. That the only way to survive is to become so strong that no one can ever take from you again. And I swore, standing over my father's body in that alley when I was 12 years old, that I would never be weak again." The rain drummed against the roof of the car, and I found myself leaning closer to him, drawn by the vulnerability he was showing me, the crack in his armor that revealed the wounded boy beneath the powerful man. "Helping people isn't weakness," I said, my voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "What you're doing for Danny, for other veterans, that's strength, Dante. That's using your power for something good." He studied my face in the dim light of passing street lamps, his expression shifting through emotions too quick to name before settling on something that looked almost like wonder. "You really believe that?" he said, not quite a question. "You really think someone like me can do good in this world?" "I think you already are," I replied, acutely aware of how close we were sitting, how his dark eyes seemed to see straight through to my soul, how this strikingly handsome man in his late 20s, who commanded an empire built on violence and control, was looking at me like I held answers to questions he'd been asking his whole life. Back at the penthouse, Dante walked me to my bedroom door despite Marco and the other security being present, and in the dim hallway with only the soft glow of accent lighting to illuminate us, the space felt smaller and more intimate than it had any right to be. I could hear Grandma's soft snoring from her room down the hall and the distant hum of the city outside, but otherwise it was silent, heavy with something unspoken that had been building between us since that first night on the balcony. "Thank you for taking me to see Danny," I said quietly, very aware that his men were positioned throughout the penthouse and could probably hear every word we said. "I know it was a risk. You were willing to fight me to get there," Dante replied, his voice low and warm in a way that sent shivers down my spine. "I'm learning that when you set your mind to something, there's no stopping you." We stood facing each other in that hallway, and the air between us felt electric, charged with tension that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with the way his eyes dropped to my lips before returning to meet my gaze. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as he stepped closer, closing the already small distance between us, until I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact, until I could feel the heat radiating from his body and smell the scent of his cologne, mixed with rain, and something uniquely him. "This can't happen," I whispered, but even as I said it, my hand came up to rest against his chest, feeling his heart beating as fast as mine under my palm. "I know," he replied, but he didn't move away, didn't step back, his own hand coming up to cup my face with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything I knew about him. "You're a criminal," I said, the words coming out without heat, just a statement of fact. "I'm nobody, just some broke waitress who gave away her last $20. "You're the first person in 20 years who's made me want to be better," Dante said, his thumb tracing my cheekbone with a touch so soft it made my breath catch. "The first person who's looked at me and seen something worth saving beneath all the blood and violence." His face was so close to mine now that I could feel his breath on my lips, could see the flecks of lighter color in his dark eyes, could count his eyelashes if I wanted to, and every cell in my body was screaming at me to close the distance, to find out what his lips would taste like, to stop thinking and just feel. But then he stepped back, his hand dropping from my face, his expression shifting from open desire to controlled restraint. "But you're right," he said, his voice rougher now. "This can't happen. Not like this. Not when you're here under my protection and don't have real freedom to choose." I felt the loss of his warmth like a physical ache as he moved toward the living room, pausing at the end of the hallway to look back at me. "Good night, Maya. Sleep well." The shattering of glass and the sharp crack of gunfire tore through the peaceful silence at 3 in the morning, and I jolted awake from dreams of dark eyes and almost kisses to find Marco bursting into my bedroom yelling for me to get Grandma and follow him now. My body moved on instinct, adrenaline flooding my system as I ran to Grandma's room, where she was sitting up in bed looking confused and frightened, and I grabbed her arm as gently as I could while still moving fast enough to keep up with Marco, who was leading us down a hallway I hadn't known existed. More gunfire erupted from the living room, along with shouting in multiple languages, and through the chaos I heard Dante's voice giving orders in that deadly calm tone that was somehow more terrifying than if he'd been yelling. Marco pushed open what looked like a closet door, but was actually the entrance to a reinforced panic room, shoving us inside and telling us to stay put, no matter what we heard, before the door sealed shut with a hiss that made my ears pop. The room was small and windowless, with monitors showing different angles of the penthouse, and on the screens I could see masked men pouring through the shattered balcony door, while Dante's security engaged them in a firefight that looked like something from an action movie, except this was real. The blood splashing across my beautiful marble floors was real. The bodies falling were real. Grandma clutched my hands so tightly I thought she might break bones, her breathing coming in short gasps that scared me more than the violence playing out on the screens. And when she pressed her other hand to her chest and gasped out that something was wrong, I felt panic rise in my throat like bile. I pounded on the door screaming for help while on the monitors I watched Dante himself take down two attackers with brutal efficiency, his movements fluid and deadly. This strikingly handsome man in his late 20s, transforming into something primal and dangerous. The firefight lasted maybe 5 minutes but felt like hours, and when it finally ended with the last attacker subdued and zip-tied on the floor, I was still holding Grandma, who was barely conscious, her lips tinged blue, her breathing shallow. The door opened, and Marco reached in to help me get Grandma out, and I emerged into a war zone, broken glass and overturned furniture and blood. So much blood on surfaces that had been pristine hours before. Paramedics were already arriving. How Dante had gotten them there so fast, I didn't know and didn't care, and they immediately took over Grandma's care while I stood frozen watching Dante crouch in front of the captured attacker. "Victor says the girl is too important to you," the man spat through broken teeth, blood running down his chin. "Says you've gone soft. Tell Victor that touching her was his last mistake." Dante replied in a voice so cold and controlled it made ice run through my veins, and I finally understood exactly what kind of man I was falling for. Grandma was stable, but the cardiac surgeon explained in gentle tones that masked the seriousness of the situation that she needed emergency surgery to repair damage from what had been a significant heart episode brought on by extreme stress. And I refused to leave the private waiting room, even though visiting hours were long over and the nurses kept suggesting I go home and rest. Dante had arranged for us to be in a private wing of the hospital, where his security could be stationed without drawing too much attention, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, he appeared with coffee from the vending machine and a sandwich he must have gotten from the cafeteria, setting them in front of me where I sat curled in an uncomfortable plastic chair. "If she dies because of me," I started to say, the guilt that had been building since the attack finally breaking through my exhaustion. "She won't," Dante interrupted, sitting down beside me close enough that our shoulders touched. "I have the best cardiac surgeon in the state operating in the morning, flown in from Johns Hopkins specifically for this, and I've made sure she has every resource available." "You can't buy everything," I whispered, not touching the food even though I couldn't remember the last time I'd eaten. "No," Dante agreed, and something in his voice made me turn to look at his face in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the waiting room. "But I can buy her the best chance, and I will. Because she matters to you, and that means she matters to me." The simple statement broke something in me, and I started crying. Not the silent tears I'd been fighting all night, but actual sobs that shook my whole body. And Dante pulled me against his chest without hesitation, one hand cradling the back of my head while the other rubbed circles on my back. "Why are you being so kind?" I asked when I could finally speak again, my voice muffled against his shirt that was probably ruined now with my tears and probably some of my makeup. "Because you showed me kindness still exists," he replied softly, his lips against my hair. "Because, in a world full of people who only care about themselves, you gave away your last dollar to help someone you barely knew, and that kind of goodness is worth protecting even if it costs me everything." We sat like that for a long time, me curled against him while he held me steady, his jacket draped around my shoulders because the hospital was cold, his men stationed at respectful distances giving us privacy, while still maintaining security. Dawn was breaking through the windows when the surgeon finally came out to tell us the operation had been successful, and the relief that flooded through me was so intense I actually felt dizzy. and Dante's arm around my waist was the only thing keeping me upright as we followed the surgeon to see Grandma in recovery. Grandma was sleeping peacefully in her hospital bed, monitors beeping softly to confirm her heart was stable, and dawn light was filtering through the windows, turning everything golden when Dante said quietly that we needed to talk about Victor. I was so exhausted that the world had taken on a surreal quality, like I was moving through a dream, and when Dante explained that Victor wouldn't stop, that the attack on the penthouse was just the beginning, and that there would be more attempts to get to me, I felt strangely detached from my own fear. In our world, family is sacred, Dante said, pulling his chair closer to mine so we could speak without disturbing Grandma. If you're my fiancé, Victor can't touch you without declaring war on all the families. It's one of the few codes that still holds weight, that attacking a made man's wife or intended is grounds for retaliation from everyone. You want a fake engagement, I said, the words coming out flat because I was too tired to process the implications properly. I want you safe, Dante replied, his dark eyes intense even in the soft morning light. This is how I can guarantee that, by making you untouchable through our customs and codes. What do you get out of it? I asked. Because even exhausted, I knew that nobody in Dante's world did anything without calculating the return. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze dropping to where my hand rested on the arm of the chair. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more vulnerable than I'd heard it. The knowledge that you're protected, he said simply. The knowledge that Victor or anyone else who might want to hurt you to get to me will think twice because you'll be under my name and my protection in a way that's recognized and respected. I stared at him, trying to understand if this was really just about protection, or if there was something else beneath his pragmatic presentation, trying to see past the careful control to whatever he was really feeling. A fake engagement, I repeated, testing the words. Until Victor is handled. And then what? We just break it off and pretend it never happened. If that's what you want, Dante said. But something flickered in his eyes that suggested that wasn't what he wanted at all. We can set whatever terms you need to feel comfortable. This isn't about trapping you, Maya. It's about keeping you alive. Behind us, Grandma stirred slightly in her sleep, and I thought about how she'd almost died because of my connection to Dante, how being near me had put her in danger, and I realized that if a fake engagement could protect her too, then maybe it was worth whatever price it might cost me. Outside the window, the city was waking up, people heading to jobs and lives that didn't involve mafia codes and protection through marriage proposals, and I felt the weight of how far I'd fallen from normal in just a few days since I'd given Danny that $20 bill. I'll do it, I said, after what felt like hours of sitting in silence watching Grandma sleep and thinking through every possible angle and consequence. But I won't be your property, Dante. I won't be some possession you acquired to solve a problem. You'll be my partner, he replied immediately, leaning forward with an intensity that suggested he'd been waiting for my answer and had already prepared his response. In every sense that matters, you'll be my equal in this arrangement. Until this is over, I added, needing that boundary established clearly. Until Victor is handled and the threat is gone, and then we end this fake engagement and go back to our separate lives. Until this is over, Dante echoed. But something shifted in his eyes when he said it, something that looked almost like disappointment or regret before his expression smoothed back into careful control. We'd moved to the hospital cafeteria by then because I needed coffee and Dante needed to make calls to set things in motion, and over terrible vending machine coffee and stale muffins we negotiated terms like we were drafting a business contract instead of planning a fake marriage. I have conditions, I said, my exhaustion giving way to a strange clarity and determination. The engagement ends when Victor is no longer a threat. You fund my return to nursing school so I can finish my degree, and the veteran housing program continues permanently, not just until this situation is resolved. Dante pulled out his phone and started typing notes, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. Done, done and done, he said without hesitation. Anything else? I want it in writing, I added, remembering my grandmother's warnings about handshake deals with dangerous men. A contract that specifies all the terms, including the fact that this is temporary and ends at my discretion once the immediate danger has passed. You'll have it by this afternoon, Dante promised, and something in his face suggested he respected me more for demanding legal documentation. Marco appeared then with another man I didn't recognize, and Dante stepped away to consult with them in low voices while I sat alone with my coffee. I couldn't hear most of what they said, but I caught Marco asking in a tone that suggested genuine concern whether Dante was actually falling for me, and Dante's response was quick and dismissive, telling Marco not to be ridiculous, that this was purely strategic. The words shouldn't have hurt because I'd been telling myself the same thing, that this was just protection and convenience and had nothing to do with the way my heart raced when he looked at me, or the way his touch made my skin burn. But hearing him deny any feelings so casually while I sat there agreeing to marry him made something twist painfully in my chest. The engagement party happened so fast I barely had time to process what was happening. One day I was sitting in a hospital cafeteria negotiating terms, and 3 days later I was standing in a designer gown that cost more than a year of my old rent in the ballroom of Dante's estate while hundreds of people I'd never met congratulated us on our upcoming marriage. The dress was beautiful, midnight blue silk that clung to curves I didn't know I had, and made me feel like an imposter playing dress-up in someone else's life. And the engagement ring on my finger was so heavy with diamonds that my hand felt weighted down by the physical manifestation of the lie we were telling. Society people mixed with men who had the same dangerous edge as Dante, all of them dressed impeccably and drinking champagne that probably cost more per bottle than I used to make in a week, and an orchestra played classical music while waiters circulated with food I couldn't identify, let alone pronounce. I felt like a fish out of water, completely out of my depth, and the only thing keeping me grounded was Dante's hand on my lower back as he guided me through the crowd, introducing me to people whose names I forgot immediately. His touch was possessive in a way that should have bothered me, but instead made me feel anchored, safe in the middle of all this overwhelming luxury and attention, and I found myself leaning into him without meaning to, seeking the comfort of his solid presence beside me. We were standing near the orchestra, accepting congratulations from an elderly couple who apparently controlled half the city's construction permits, when I felt Dante's entire body tense, his hand tightening almost painfully on my waist, and I looked up to see a man approaching us who made every survival instinct I had start screaming. He was older than Dante, maybe late 40s, with silver at his temples and cold eyes that reminded me of a shark, and he was flanked by men who looked like they ate violence for breakfast. Such a fairy tale, the man said in an accent that was thickly Russian, his eyes raking over me in a way that made my skin crawl. Street girl marries prince of the underworld. It's almost poetic. Victor, Dante said, and his voice carried a warning that was clear even to me. I'm merely offering my blessing, Dante, Victor continued, a smile on his lips that didn't reach his dead eyes. May your marriage be long. The pause before the word long made it clear he meant the opposite. Made it a threat barely disguised as courtesy, and I felt Dante's muscles coiling like he was preparing to strike. We appreciate your blessing, I said before Dante could respond, surprising myself and apparently everyone else in earshot. It takes a big man to wish happiness to others, especially in a world where happiness is so rare. The first dance was supposed to be the moment that sold our engagement to everyone watching, and Dante had pulled me into his arms with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the deadly man I'd seen interrogate Victor's attacker, his hand on my waist, as we moved to the orchestra's rendition of something classical and romantic that I didn't recognize. I could feel hundreds of eyes on us, and tried to focus on following his lead and not tripping in the unfamiliar heels, and he must have sensed my tension because he leaned down to whisper that I was doing perfectly and just needed to trust him. The lights cut out with no warning, plunging the ballroom into complete darkness, and in the split second before the chaos erupted, I felt Dante's body go rigid with recognition of danger, his arms tightening around me in a grip that was no longer about dancing, but about protection. Gunfire exploded from multiple directions, muzzle flashes illuminating the darkness in strobe light bursts that showed overturned tables and guests screaming and running for exits. And I felt rather than saw Dante spin us around, putting himself between me and where the shots were coming from. The impact of the bullet hitting him drove us both to the ground, his weight crushing me into the marble floor, and it took my stunned brain several seconds to realize that the warm wetness spreading across my white gown was blood. His blood, pouring from a wound in his shoulder that would have hit me center mass if he hadn't turned us. "Don't you dare die on me!" I screamed, my hands finding the wound and pressing down hard the way I'd learned in my incomplete nursing training, blood pouring between my fingers as his men returned fire, and the ballroom became a war zone. "Thought you wanted this to end," Dante said, his voice weak and rough, consciousness already slipping from his eyes as he looked up at me. "Not like this," I sobbed, pressing harder on the wound even as blood soaked through the expensive fabric of my dress and pooled on the floor beneath us. "Never like this. Stay with me, Dante. Please stay with me." "Maya, he started to say, but his eyes rolled back and his body went limp beneath my hands, and I was screaming for help when Marco appeared and took over applying pressure while paramedics rushed in. The shooting had stopped, Dante's men having neutralized the attackers with brutal efficiency, and as I was pulled away from Dante's unconscious form, I saw Victor's body crumpled near the entrance, killed not by Dante's men, but by crossfire from his own people. Poetic justice for the man who'd started this whole nightmare by attacking someone I'd tried to help. They wheeled Dante into surgery, and I followed as far as they would let me, standing in the hallway covered in his blood while nurses tried to convince me to go clean up and change clothes. But I wouldn't, because leaving felt like abandoning him, and I'd already lost too many people I cared about. I sat in the private waiting room for 6 hours while surgeons worked to remove the bullet and repair the damage. Marco bringing me coffee I didn't drink and trying to get me to eat food I couldn't taste. And when they finally came out to say he was stable and in recovery, I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was strangling me. The nurse tried one more time to get me to change out of the ruined designer gown that was stiff with dried blood, but I just shook my head and followed her to his room where machines beeped steadily and IV lines ran into his arm, and he looked so still and pale against the white sheets that fear spiked through me again. I pulled a chair close to his bedside and took his hand carefully, mindful of the IV, and I must have fallen asleep like that, because the next thing I knew, dawn light was streaming through the windows, and I heard a voice, rough with sleep and medication, saying my name. "You stayed," Dante said when I jerked awake and met his eyes, dark and conscious and alive, his voice weak but carrying genuine wonder like he couldn't believe I was there. "Of course I stayed, you idiot," I said, tears streaming down my face before I could stop them. "You took a bullet for me, where else would I be?" "That's my job," he replied, his thumb moving slightly against my palm where I still held his hand. "I protect what's," and I cut him off before he could finish. "Don't say it," I interrupted, my voice fierce despite the tears. "Don't say what's mine like I'm a possession or property you're defending." "I was going to say what I love," Dante finished, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that made my breath catch despite the weakness of his voice. "I love you, Maya, have since I saw you give away that money, since I watched you walk 8 blocks in the rain rather than spend $2 on the subway, since you negotiated with me to help veterans instead of just taking my protection and staying quiet." "What?" I whispered, the word barely making it past the lump in my throat, shock and hope and fear all tangling together. "I love you," he repeated, his hand tightening on mine. "I love your compassion and your strength, and the way you see good in people, even when they don't deserve it. And I know this started as protection and necessity, but somewhere along the way it became real for me. You became everything." "I fell in love with a criminal," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them, my hand still gripping his like it was the only thing keeping me anchored to reality. What does that make me? What does it say about who I am that I can sit here covered in your blood and feel grateful you're alive instead of horrified by the violence and the danger and everything you represent? Human, Dante replied, his thumb still moving in small circles against my palm. It makes you human, Maya, capable of seeing past labels to the man underneath, capable of understanding that people are more complicated than good or evil, criminal or saint. But your world, I continued, tears streaming down my face now in earnest. The violence, the danger, Victor attacking and Danny getting hurt, and your men dying in our penthouse, and you taking a bullet meant for me. How can I accept that as part of my life? How can I ask my grandmother to accept it? I'll walk away from it, Dante said suddenly, struggling to sit up straighter despite the obvious pain the movement caused. For you, I'll go legitimate. I have enough legitimate businesses to walk away from the rest. I can transition everything over the next year and we can have a normal life, Maya. I swear, I'll give you normal if that's what you need. No, I interrupted, the word coming out fierce and certain in a way that surprised us both. I won't ask you to change who you are, Dante. I won't be the woman who takes a man and tries to remake him into something else, something safer and smaller, and less than what he is. His eyes searched my face like he was trying to understand what I was really saying, his own tears forming now, and I realized this strikingly handsome man in his late 20s, who commanded an empire and faced down enemies without flinching, was crying because of me. I love you, I said, finally admitting the truth I'd been running from since that first night on the balcony. I love you exactly as you are, the good and the bad, and the dangerous and the kind, the man who protects what he loves and who builds housing for veterans and who took a bullet for me without hesitation. His hand squeezed mine so tightly it almost hurt, and he pulled me closer despite the IV lines and the bandages until our foreheads were touching. Say it again, he whispered against my lips. I love you, I repeated, and this time when the distance between us closed and his lips found mine, it wasn't about attraction or tension or almost kisses in hallways, but about truth and choice, and a love that had grown in the space between danger and safety. You said I made you want to be better, I said when the kiss finally ended and we were both breathless and smiling despite everything we'd been through. Let me help you do that, Dante. Let's take this fake engagement and make it real but on our terms, using your resources and power to actually help people while we slowly transition your empire into something legitimate. He pulled back slightly to look at my face, searching for signs that I was joking or saying what I thought he wanted to hear. You'd really marry me, he asked, his voice carrying a vulnerability I'd never heard from him before. Not as protection, not as a business arrangement, but as a choice, as something you actually want. I'd marry you because I love you, I replied, reaching up to cup his face with my free hand, feeling the stubble on his jaw and the warmth of his skin. Because you saw value in a woman who gave away her last dollar when everyone else just saw someone in the way, because underneath everything, you're still the man who wanted to help veterans because of your father, because I think together we can do something meaningful with all this power you've accumulated. His eyes were shining with tears and something that looked like hope and wonder as he processed what I was offering, a real partnership that didn't require him to abandon who he was, but invited him to become something more. We could expand the veteran housing program, I continued. The idea's flowing now that I'd committed to this path. Use your construction contacts to build more facilities, your legitimate businesses to provide job training and employment, your influence to advocate for better services, and gradually over time, transition away from the criminal enterprises while using the money they've generated to do actual good in the world. 2 days later, we were leaving the hospital, Dante moving carefully, but insisting he was fine, despite the bandage under his shirt and the pain medication he refused to take because he said he needed to think clearly. Marco drove us back to the penthouse through a city painted gold and orange by the setting sun, and in the back seat, Dante and I sat close together, making plans for a future that looked nothing like either of us had imagined a week ago. The engagement would become real, the wedding would happen once he was healed, and together we would start the work of transformation, taking an empire built on violence and slowly, carefully, methodically turning it into something that honored both his father's memory and my belief that kindness could change the world. One person, one choice, one act of compassion at a time. The wedding happened 3 months later, in the private garden behind Dante's estate, on a warm evening when the air smelled of roses, and the string lights Marco had hung made everything look soft and magical. And instead of hundreds of guests, there were maybe 20 people, the ones who actually mattered, the ones who knew the truth of us. I wore a simple white dress that Grandma had helped me pick out, nothing like the designer gown from the engagement party, just clean lines and lace sleeves, and a skirt that moved when I walked, and when I came down the garden path on Marco's arm, because he'd somehow become like family to me. Over these months, I saw Dante waiting under an arch covered in flowers, and the look on his face made my breath catch. He was crying, this strikingly handsome man in his late 20s who commanded respect through fear and power was standing there with tears streaming down his face as he watched me walk toward him, and I realized I was crying too, happy tears for once instead of the terrified ones I'd shed so many times since that night at the pharmacy. Grandma sat in the front row looking healthy and strong after her surgery and recovery, Danny beside her in a suit that Dante had bought him, clean and sober, and living in the first completed unit of the veteran housing program that now bore his name. And when we reached the front and the officiant asked us to share our vows, Dante took my hands and his voice shook as he spoke. "I was a man who'd forgotten what goodness looked like until you showed me," he said, his thumbs tracing circles on my palms. "I vow to be worthy of your kindness every day, to use what I have to help rather than harm, to be the man you see when you look at me instead of the man I was before you." "I vow to see you," I replied, my own voice breaking with emotion, "not your power, not your past, but your heart. And I vow to protect it as fiercely as you protect me, to stand beside you as we build something good from all the darkness, to love you not despite who you are, but because of it." When the officiant pronounced us married and Dante kissed me, it wasn't the passionate desperation of the hospital or the restrained almost kiss in the hallway, but something deeper and more permanent, a promise sealed with witnesses who knew what it had cost us to get here. The small group erupted in applause and cheers, Grandma dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, Danny grinning like he'd won the lottery, Marco looking satisfied like he'd orchestrated the whole thing, and as the sun set over the garden, turning everything gold. We celebrated not a fake engagement meant to fool enemies, but a real union built on choice and love, and the belief that even people from completely different worlds could find their way to each other. 6 months after the wedding, I found myself standing on the same street corner where this whole impossible story had started. But everything looked different now. The pharmacy still stood with its flickering neon sign, but next door was the newly opened Second Chances Veterans Center, where Danny worked as the facilities manager, overseeing housing placement for homeless veterans across the city. Maya had just finished her morning classes at nursing school, where she was finally completing the degree she'd abandoned years ago, Dante having not just paid her tuition, but endowed a scholarship program for other students who'd had to drop out due to financial hardship, and we'd come to check on the center's progress and have lunch with Danny, who wanted to show us the latest resident success stories. "You two changed my life," Danny said, as we sat in his small office that had his name on the door and photos of the veterans he'd helped on the walls, his eyes clear and his face healthy in a way I'd never seen during his years on the streets. "You changed ours, Danny," I replied honestly, "because if I hadn't given him that $20 bill that rainy night, I would never have caught Dante's attention, never have been pulled into his world, never have discovered that love, could exist in the space between darkness and light. After lunch, Dante and I walked back toward where the car was parked, his hand in mine, both of us comfortable in the silence that came from truly knowing another person. And that's when I saw him, a young man huddled in the doorway of a closed storefront with a cardboard sign asking for help and a dog on a rope leash beside him. I pulled out my wallet without thinking, extracting 2 20s and crossing the street to press them into his hand, along with a card for the Veterans Center in case he qualified for services. And when I returned to Dante's side, he was watching me with an expression that was pure love, mixed with amusement. "You're still giving money away," he observed, wrapping his arm around my waist as we continued walking. "It's our money now," I replied, leaning into his warmth. "And this is who I am, Dante. I can't see someone struggling and not try to help." "I know," he said, pressing a kiss to my temple. "It's why I love you, why I'll always love you. Because you showed me that kindness isn't weakness, and that using power to help rather than harm is the strongest thing a person can do." "What we saw shocked everyone," I said, thinking about all the people who'd been scandalized by our relationship, the society matrons who whispered about the street girl who'd trapped a powerful man, the criminals who thought Dante had gone soft, the mafia boss who fell in love with kindness, who let a woman with nothing change everything. He smiled and pulled me closer as we reached the car where Marco waited. "Not fell in love with kindness," he corrected. "Fell in love with you, and through you, remembered that the world could be better than I'd let myself believe. And that's worth more than any empire I could have built on fear alone."